Welcome to this very special episode of the Non-Obvious Insights Show and an episode that is part of the Non-Obvious Beyond Diversity Summit. I am very, very happy to be joined today by my friend Veena Jayadeva, the head of corporate social responsibility at Guardian Life. Veena, how are you?
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. I am so excited to talk to you because you are working in the space of diversity and inclusion in a pretty big company, but your title is not specifically about diversity and inclusion, and that's very intentional. And so I wonder if maybe we could start with that, and you could just talk a little bit about how you think about this role of bringing more diversity and inclusion to the company that you're at, and where it sits in the overall organization.
So, inclusion and diversity at Guardian Life formally sits in human resources. But as the lead for corporate social responsibility at my company, I really sit at the intersection of corporate responsibility, inclusion and diversity, and environmental sustainability. And so for me, inclusion and diversity um, is embedded in pretty much everything that I do. So when I think about how we engage with our employees, I try to take a very D&I kind of lens to the work that I do. When I talk about the grant making that I undertake in terms of the philanthropic giving to nonprofit communities, it's really around bringing that inclusion diversity lens to that work also. The
Mhm.
great thing about leading a function that is, quite frankly, just necessitates us having to work across departments and across the business means that when I bring this inclusion diversity lens to everything I do, I bring that piece to all the conversations I'm having, right? So it can be around sourcing and vendors, it can be around talent pipeline, it can be around the everyday actions that employees can take to make our company, but then our society a more inclusive place to live and work. So to me, inclusion and diversity isn't necessarily just a standalone function. My mission really is to embed this type of perspective um, in not just the work that I do, but encourage individuals, no matter where they sit within an organization, what their function is, to take on that type of a lens to everything that they do, including everyday decisions.
Yeah, it strikes me that, one of the things that we talk about when it comes to diversity and inclusion is uh, fixing the underrepresentation that happens and avoiding marginalizing groups. And sometimes what does happen in organizations is you have a group creating this function of diversity and inclusion, and it's sort of built with a lot of fanfare, but it has limited power, limited budget, limited ability to actually impact change within an organization. And you're ironically marginalizing the group that's supposed to fix the marginalization in the first place. And the way that you're doing it, where it does integrate across, seems, at least on a logical level, to be the way that everyone should be thinking about it. So why do you think that there are so many organizations that really don't structure it that way or think about it in that way and do create sort of a center of excellence model? And do you think that could also work, or is it just that that model will evolve to what you have now?
So I'm not so much against a center of excellence type of a model. I will say even within corporate social responsibility, we fall within a particular part of the organization. The trick is, I mean, I personally think I can never have enough resources to do the work that I really want to do and bring about the change that I'm looking to bring about, whether it's in my organization or in society more broadly. You can't give me a big enough budget to do that. But I think it's similar in inclusion and diversity where you can have a center of excellence, but the key is that collaboration piece across the organization, right? Building the right relationships amongst your executives, working across all of your businesses, having a really deep understanding of what does inclusion and diversity mean, and having that embedded at all levels of the organization. That's when you're going to bring to bear the true resources, right? That an organization can have against, putting against an effort like this. So, you know, I I'm not against organizations having chief diversity officers, but that chief diversity officer or a head of corporate social responsibility, for example, can only do so much, right? We can accomplish so
Yeah.
much more when we're working together and bringing all of our resources to bear together.
Well, and I think one of the things that has shifted in the world, which is I think offers us all a lot of hope, is that this function of corporate social responsibility, CSR, is not new. I mean, it's been around for a long time, but I think it's achieved a new relevance because there's so many more organizations that are realizing, hey, look, people are making purchasing decisions based on how we act as a company and whether we're good stewards of the environment and whether we are bring in diverse employees and believe in inclusion. And not only that, but they're making the decisions on who to work for. So it becomes kind of a talent pipeline issue as well. If you're not doing some of these things, it's harder for you to attract the best talent because the best talent wants to work for a place that they believe is putting something good out into the world. So having been in this space for some time now, have you seen a shift over the last 5 years, maybe 10 years even? Not to date you on on any of this, but like, has there been a profound change, or is it just a perception that there's a change?
No, I definitely think there's been a profound change. I think there's been a profound change because obviously, when you have a new generation coming into the workforce, their expectations of what does it mean to be affiliated with a company. So as an employee, even as a contractor, let's be honest about it, right? You are spending your time um, furthering the goals of a corporate entity. You want to make sure that that time you're spending is with an organization that you can align with. I think it's becoming more and more relevant. In fact, I've heard anecdotally from the recruiting side, they get questions all the time. Um, so what are
Yeah.
you doing in this space? What are you doing in terms of environmental sustainability? What are you doing in terms of climate change? What are you doing in terms of inclusion and diversity? How do you get involved in the community? How do your employees give back? Um, it's interesting that we would think about it, I think, years ago in terms of how do we create a sense of belonging for those who are already part of the company. But really, it's also a really important mechanism for bringing in new talent, and demonstrating that
Mm.
there's a place for you. Whether the way that I like to think about it is we have initiatives that certainly align with what, from a corporate perspective, we're trying to achieve in our communities, but there also has to be space for letting people really um, pursue their passions and their interests, right? Beyond kind of what the company wants you to do. So when I think of CSR, I think about it really holistically in terms of how do employees support what the company is trying to do in the community, but then how is the company, on the other hand, also supporting employees in amplifying and providing opportunity for them to pursue their own passions.
It's really, really important. I mean, what you're speaking about is this idea that a lot of times people who work in corporate culture or workplace culture talk about of allowing your team to bring their whole selves to work, not just the skill set that they've got, but also like their beliefs and their desires to make a positive impact in the world. And there's so many different elements of that, and I think that for a lot of people who may be watching who aren't quite as familiar with either the field of CSR or the potential initiatives that you had mentioned. Let's talk about some of those initiatives and what they do. So, can you kind of take us inside behind the scenes and share what some of these initiatives look like? Like, what are the actual things that you lead that fit into this function?
Absolutely, and I'll talk about it from an inclusion and diversity lens also, if that helps. So corporate social responsibility teams typically will have um, strategic partnerships with nonprofit organizations that just in some way, shape, or form align with the business of the company. So I work in a life insurance company. So some of the partnerships that we have are around financial empowerment. We do a lot of investments in the economic opportunity space around workforce development and workforce readiness, because that's something that we're really passionate about. Investing in digital skills building and addressing the digital divide as companies become more and more tech forward. This is something that we feel really passionate about. So there will be major nonprofit partnerships that I have nationally and locally where employees can jump in and volunteer. But at the same time, there are plenty of colleagues who, quite frankly, on their own time, have an affiliation with a a local nonprofit that they've been volunteering at for years, and it really means something to them. That really means something to their family. It really means something to their community in terms of addressing a pressing need in their local area. And we want to be able to say, you know what, um, you should be able to, to support those organizations. So whether it's companies that have flexible time off policies that allows you to volunteer on your own, or companies that allow you to, if you're volunteering on weekends, log in your hours and apply for a grant, corporate money that will go to support that particular nonprofit. There are lots of ways that companies can support not just their own corporate goals in corporate social responsibility, but also the individual passions of their colleagues. And one thing you mentioned around um, companies not wanting to only harness the talent and the skills of their employees in terms of their day job, but also supporting their personal passion. I would say there's an intersection of the two. There are a lot of opportunities that I think are yet undiscovered in terms of, everybody has a skill set, right, that they're bringing to bear. How
Yeah.
can that skill set be leveraged to make a difference in the community, right? There are a lot of nonprofit organizations out there that are in need of capacity building, quite frankly, and these companies have the talent to help in that way. But the only way to uncover that is through partnerships and having dialogue and the conversation of, what do you need? How can I help you? Right? It's not just about, I'm going to
Uh-huh.
cut a check and I'm going to give it to you. And I'm not against that, right? As a former nonprofit executive, actually it doesn't matter what seat
Checks
what
are great.
nonprofit. You're always fundraising
Yeah.
for money, right? So money is not a bad thing, but what more can you do, right? Because again, there's no
Yeah.
check that even I as an individual can cut that's going to help solve all the problems of a nonprofit partner. If I can come in and say, well, you know what, here's my skill set. Here's a network of organizations and people that I have access to. What are your problems? Let me see if I can come up with a creative, collaborative way to help you move the needle on what you're trying to do. Like that's what I think. That's what I think is really necessary to make a true impact.
Yeah, and let's talk about impact because that is a big topic of conversation in the world of CSR. Are the things that we're doing, are the things that we're investing in, truly moving the needle? Needle? Are they actually having an impact? And one of the things that many organizations do is sort of an annual CSR report, which is partially intended to try and answer that, and partially a bit of, and this is not to minimize it in any way, a bit of storytelling around some of the stories that did deliver that sort of impact, because that is part of what adds context to what these efforts are. And frankly, a lot of times that report is also released along the same time as like a shareholder report and some of the other things that are kind of drier in terms of just, here are the numbers, here's the top line revenue, here's like so like this adds a little context into like, look, we're doing these other things, we believe in these other things. How important is storytelling as a part of demonstrating the value that CSR has beyond the numbers? I mean, there's obviously going to be some numbers in terms of, these are the number of people we helped, these are the number of homes we built, these are the numbers of, people we fed. I mean, there's tangible things like that depending on who you partner with, but there's also the stories. So talk a little bit about how important those stories are.
I think storytelling is key. I mean, storytelling is really important from the beginning when we get involved with an organization, all through that relationship, and it's important for a number of different reasons. I mean, I think one, when I look to bring on that executive engagement, when I'm looking to get our employees interested in the topics that these nonprofits are trying to address in their community and get these employees involved, the storytelling aspect is oh so important. Me just putting together a fact sheet and sending it out saying, hey, this is a really great organization, you should join in, isn't going to do it. But if
Yeah.
I can tell the story of the systemic barriers that a given organization is trying to break down in a community, especially a community that is under resourced, that and the organization has a long track record there, and I have stories of individuals and families and just community members more broadly that have been impacted by this organization. I think it's a much more compelling way to drive that engagement piece of it, right? Whether it's volunteering, whether it's
Yeah.
giving, um, whether it's just learning more, right? Piquing that curiosity of our colleagues to say, just take a moment to learn a little bit more about what's really at play in our communities. Um, the storytelling piece of it is absolutely important. And then when I think about it in terms of, as you mentioned, like the CSR report, annual report that goes out, you're right that beyond the financial numbers, there are people who want to know what more is happening in the community. When you look at it from the talent pipeline recruiting standpoint, I should hope that candidates are looking at that company's latest annual report to see, is this a financially sound company? What are their practices in the environmental space and CSR and inclusion and diversity? Like, it is that holistic picture of what is a company doing, and how do they do it? I think that's a really important piece for the younger generations, the new generations of colleagues that are coming into the workplace.
Yeah, it really is, and it is such a critical component. I want to sort of in the remaining time that we have together, I want to have you sort of put on your CSR guide hat, if you have such a hat, and think
I'm
about
wearing it right now.
yeah, okay, all right. It looks good. I like it. And I'd love for you to think about just, I mean, you're at a larger organization that has, some resources, not unlimited resources, but you have some resources. You have a team, and you've been doing this in a very professional capacity. There are going to be people who are watching who are perhaps at smaller organizations, who are entrepreneurs, for whom this idea of leading more diversity and inclusion, creating a more inclusive workplace, being more inclusive with the products and services that they offer is important to them, but they're kind of at the starting gate and they want to figure out what to do first or how to start with this. How would you advise them? What tips could you offer to them to help them kind of get into this space, to get started with thinking in this way?
So for me, what's been helpful is, first of all, identifying a group of colleagues who want to be engaged in this kind of work. Right? It's a little bit of a hand raising exercise, but you really have to understand um, who are the fellow employees who want to be engaged in this work, and also serve as a bit of like a think tank, right? In terms of providing feedback on everything from your recruiting processes. Where are you sourcing candidates from? What are your job descriptions looking like? To sussing out interest in terms of forming employee resource groups, so affinity groups for different employees, and thinking about, if we were to have from a corporate social responsibility angle, um, involvement in the local community, what could that look like, and how does it tie back to what the company actually does, right? What is the mission of the company, and how could that tie back to how they're giving back in the community? So I don't think any one person who's interested in this can do it all. I think you always have to have with you a group of stakeholders, internal stakeholders that you're working with, whether it's your executive team, whether it's a council of colleagues that come across different departments and different levels of the organization. But you really have to figure out, like, you know, what is the interest and appetite for taking on certain pieces of this. And there's no one right way to start a program, but I think that the buy-in piece of it is absolutely crucial. It's crucial not just from the resourcing standpoint, which is always you know which is always obviously something that's important, but the engagement piece of it. Because again, you can't go at this alone. It's always a collaborative effort.
Great words of wisdom. I just want to say thank you for spending a little bit of time with us talking about this very important topic, sharing your wisdom, sharing your insights. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
You're welcome. That was Veena Jayadeva, Head of Corporate Social Responsibility at Guardian Life. We have more conversations about leading diversity and inclusion coming up right now at the Non-Obvious Beyond Diversity Summit. I hope you enjoy them. Welcome back to this special discussion about leading diversity and inclusion. I am very, very excited now to introduce you to my guest, Scott Lanham, who is the Assistant Director for Diversity and Civil Rights at the Department of Homeland Security, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Scott, how are you?
I'm great. Having a great day. Appreciate
Good.
the invite.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. Now, tell us a little bit. First of all, you need to explain the role, because it is quite a mouthful, as we were joking about right before we got on camera. So
It is.
tell us about your role, your responsibilities, what you spend your time doing.
Sure. As I'm sure your folks know, Department of Homeland Security is a relatively new agency. This is a relatively new office within the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. Ultimately, my job is to ensure that all ICE stakeholders are afforded the protection of their civil rights. So that's the folks that work within our agency to ensure that we are treating each other with respect and with consideration of fair treatment and equal opportunity, and anyone that we engage with through any of our law enforcement duties and responsibilities, that we engage with them, that we provide them our services, that we treat them in a way respectful of civil rights.
That seems inarguably important, and something that I think we would all want to see happen.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, I think that for some people it might seem like you're in a role that is almost impossibly difficult, because of the vastness of what you're trying to accomplish, and the number of people and moving pieces and politics and all of those things involved. So
Sure.
talk a little bit about the challenge of doing what you're doing, where you're doing it, and how you rise to meet that challenge.
Sure. Well, actually, it's only possible if it's done under the vein, in the thinking that it's part of leadership responsibility to ensure that we treat each other with respect and dignity. It would be impossible to do my job if I were solely responsible for ensuring that civil rights were an everyday reality. So the reason why I was really interested and kind of excited about participating in the discussion is to talk about the role and responsibility that true leadership has when you infuse the values of diversity and inclusion and protection of civil rights and the thinking of equal opportunity into basic leadership norms and principles. And conversely, when you do that, when you define leadership and define and promote and reward leaders who do understand and do absorb and do reflect that value, it becomes not such an impossible task.
Yeah, and contrast for us, when you're working on this when you're doing this type of work, how much of it comes down to kind of policy and the written things, and how much of it comes down to the culture of
Sure.
work, and the culture of what you actually inspire among the people who are doing this work.
Yeah. So there's an old saying that I absolutely adhere to, which is that culture eats policy for breakfast, right? So it really is about the culture that gets established in an agency. What people believe, and the way that those beliefs are reflected in their day-to-day behaviors. That said, it's important to have policy, right? It's important to set up rules, to set up guidelines, to have ceilings, to have established expectations of what we define as acceptable behavior. And so, and you are right, a considerable part of my job is reviewing policy and implementing policy that comes from the White House or from the Secretary's office at the department.
Yeah, actually, that was going to be my very next question, which is, I mean, we're obviously in a moment right now where the administration's changed, the leadership has changed. How much impact has that had on your day-to-day work? Has it totally flipped it? Has it had a minimal impact? Is it likely to have more impact? Like, just gauge for us, like, how momentous of a change is this for you and what you do every day?
It's big. I mean, it is pretty big. So again, back to your original question, the basic values of, do we treat people with respect? That's consistent. That doesn't change. There's no administration that would ever, be able to establish an expectation that you don't treat people with respect. And this is a law enforcement agency, even more so, right? So, the people that are predisposed to be law enforcement officers are people that are desiring to help people. That's why people get law enforcement. And so, the people that are with our agency are ones who want to follow the rules and want to follow the law and want to ensure that people are protected and treated right. But that said, how you do it, the implementation of those ideas, that's the executive orders the president has issued, the policy development that we understand is coming, down the line relatively soon. It's pretty dramatic. It's not.
Yeah.
It's a change of more than degree, but type. And to tell you the truth, I and my counterparts within the department were pretty excited about embracing, fully embracing the passion with which the White House is conveying these values, particularly, the White House, the president being comfortable standing up and saying that his administration is going to be one that is known for protecting civil rights, and going to be one that should be evaluated on how it really, in fact, reflects diversity and inclusion. What he's done with his cabinet selection so far, the guidance we've gotten just from the few officials we've been able to talk to, it's pretty exciting, daunting, but pretty exciting.
Yeah, and just to level set for people who might be watching this disconnected to the time and space that we are right now, we are pretty much a week into a new presidential administration here in the U.S. Joe Biden's taken over. And so just to kind of set the framework for our conversation, I mean, it's highly relevant right now because, as you alluded to, several of the new president's executive orders have dealt directly with immigration policy and customs and policy and things that relate directly to your work. So that's
we're having
the
a little bit
momentousness
of a sound challenge here. I think I missed the last part of that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was just saying that several of the recent executive announcements and executive orders have been related to the world of immigration and policies related to that. So there have been some pretty significant changes.
Yeah, very.
A lot of times when you're working in the federal government, you kind of get painted with the picture of when things go wrong, and not necessarily when things go right. And the IRS is a great example of that. A lot of people, the biggest check they get all year in America comes from the IRS, and yet, everybody hates the IRS. And so, like, when you deal with that challenge and you're trying to tell the positive side of what ICE is doing or what the immigration story is, I'm sure there is a positive side, right? Because you deal with millions of people. I mean, you're dealing with a high volume of people. And so there are some negative situations which tend to get attention. But what about the positive? Like, how do you tell the positive side of that story?
Well, a couple of things, right? So first of all, you got to show up. So I got here to ICE about 10 years ago. So I got here at a time in which it was still a little bit of a memory, still a fresh memory of 9/11, and so the way in which the agency was perceived by the public was tied to national security more than law enforcement, and so I've been able to see sort of a shift a little bit. But when I got here, one of my mentors, one of the directors, said, "Scott, you got to level set. You got to recognize that in this agency, one half of the people are going to be upset with you every day, no matter what, right? So." 50% of the public are going to say that we're not doing enough to protect the public, and we're not doing enough to ensure national security, and 50% of the public are going to say you're doing way too much and your priorities are messed up. And so there's probably some truth in both of those. I think I don't think that there's anyone in law enforcement who would say that we are ever doing enough or that we always do it right, and certainly all of us are striving to do better every day. That said, it's critical that we, back to the conversation of diversity and inclusion, there's no possibility of us getting it right if we don't have an organization that is comprised of people who come from different backgrounds, who have different perceptions, and if we don't have a culture that values what they bring, right? That allows our workforce and the public to communicate with us and express to us their concerns about what we do or how we're doing it or how much we're doing it. And conversely, I think if we're open to that, it's hard sometimes. I think we're open to that, then we really are being the public servants that we all, take an oath to be.
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the things that we find, over and over during this summit, as we've been having all these interviews. One of the things that's really come through is when you have a more diverse and inclusive team, the policies and the things that get enacted are by their very nature more diverse because of the way that people think and because they're dealing with people who look like them.
I mean, it's critical just in an everyday sense, right? So, someone from the public, or we may get a letter, or there may be a newspaper report, or there may be, some story that 90% of the room reacts in a certain way to that story based on our own experiences and our own biases. It's critical there's someone in that room that has a different perspective to say, wait, that is not what I am hearing. And I don't think that's what the person is saying. And let's consider it this way. And certainly, you can designate someone to be that person, but if they don't have the background and the experience and the vision to have that perspective, then it's going to be missed. And another part of your question, kind of goes to culture, is we have to, and we do, law enforcement agencies have to have a value for that level of diversity being in that room, which means it's got to be reflected in the assignments that we make. It's got to be reflected in the promotions that we have. It's got to be reflected in, who's going to be in the room when we decide what's important to do. That's culture.
And you've been there for now, I think you said 10 years.
10 years,
So yeah, so I mean, you're very familiar with the network and with the team that is currently in place. How would you grade the team right now in terms of its diversity and inclusiveness, and where would you like it to be? Like, if you were to kind of grade it on a scale of 1 to 10 based on where it is now and where it could or should be in the future.
Well, I think we are not there. I think it's inarguable that we're not there. So, I'll talk about my agency in particular. I know ICE the best, although, I think all of DHS would say we have work to do. The biggest challenge in law enforcement, and this is at the state and local level and federal level, is, a lack of representation of women in our core occupations, in our major occupations. In ICE, we have special agents and we have law enforcement officers. In total, there's, somewhere around 15,000 of them in the agency. Women are represented, but nowhere near represented enough. And as I said, that's writ large for all law enforcement agencies, and women are in no way represented enough at a higher level. And so there are some huge implications of that for the core missions that ICE has, right? So, we are engaging with men and women and children all over the country and indeed all over the world. And you need that diversity of gender and the viewpoint that diversity of gender brings to you. So we are less capable in reality than we would be if we did a better job at attracting and promoting and being represented by women in the agency. It's my number one concern. It's the thing that keeps me up literally every single night. Myself and my counterparts in our human capital office and in all of the core offices, it's kind of like the single line of discussion on how do we do better. We try different things, but how do we do better? And it's true for all law enforcement agencies. And I have long since been convinced that there's just an organic reality to the benefit of having more women in law enforcement. It just changes the way everything is done. And I'm not giving it up. And again, given the guidance of the president, I don't think he's going to tolerate not having more progress than we've had. And I'm kind of glad to hear that.
Yeah, it certainly seems like it. I mean, from the beginning, and I think, not just in law enforcement, there are many other industries I think that could benefit from having the same sort of shift as well. So, the last question I wanted to ask you was just about this shift and making it actionable for people. I mean, one of the big things we're trying to do at the summit is we want to give people some actionable advice and lessons and things for what they can do. And I know that in a role like what you have, working in the federal government, working in immigration, like that seems quite disconnected from anything that would be under my control to be able to impact in any way as a ordinary citizen. Can you bring it to the people who are watching and listening and give them some sort of lessons that might shift their perspective to it, either help them better understand what actually happens in the process of immigration and law enforcement that you work in, or what they might be able to do differently to either change their perception or talk to others about what happens?
Sure. Well, so I appreciate the question. And I actually think, we have a window of opportunity within ICE. I'll talk for ICE specifically. We have a window of opportunity within ICE, given the new administration and the change in the direction that it looks like the administration is going to promote, to find ways to connect. And so as a practical matter, every one of the ICE offices that are located across the country, hold citizens academies. And those are opportunities for regular everyday citizens, business people, teachers, to really learn what the agency does. And we've got a small course that we put people through. It's kind of rigorous, but it sort of explains to regular folks who maybe have never had any dealings with government what this agency does, and it's an opportunity to give feedback to the agency Once you know what we do and how we do it, you can tell us, hey, I don't agree with how this is done, or I think there's a better way to do things, or what often happens is, we have business peoples or community leaders who say, I didn't realize you were involved in this area. Here's a place where we can help you. That's been true for ICE's roles in human trafficking and fighting child pornography and lots of immigration-related crimes and lots of cross-border crimes, drugs. I mean, so there's an opportunity for every person in this country who's interested in what this agency does to literally pick up the phone book, call the agent, call your local office and say, look, I'd like to learn more about what ICE does. I do also think that there's a role for community groups and affinity groups who want to have a voice in how the government and how the agency and how the country conducts immigration enforcement and conducts. I think that there's a role for you to continue to have a voice through your elected leadership, through appointed leadership by contacting our offices. Believe it or not, we are actually interested in hearing from the public who see what we do. And often, as you said when you started, often the public thinks they know what we do, and they got it wrong. But we don't know that until they tell us this is what they see. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with folks who have no idea what the scope of the mission is. And when we sit and have a conversation about it, look, they may agree or disagree with the national policy, but you can't disagree with someone who's trying to make your community better and trying to protect you and your kids. And that's sort of the conversation that I want.
Yeah. So tell us once again, how do we find out about that program that you mentioned? How can people get involved in that?
So thanks to the internet, right? You can literally go online and look at the ICE website, but the ICE national website in Washington, D.C., the Public Affairs Office is a great contact. But actually, every one of our major offices located regionally throughout the country, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, have community relations officers whose job it is to connect with the public. And so if you're in Cleveland, or if you're in Detroit, or if you're in Chicago, or if you're in Houston, or if you're in San Diego, there's a local office there. And I would encourage anyone who's interested, in learning what we do, or if you think you have some ideas or suggestions for how we can do things better, absolutely connect with ICE. We're always interested in having the public learn what we do. And ultimately, we believe that the more you really learn about what we do, the more support you're going to have for us.
Well, there you go. There's a eye-opening look at what ICE actually does, and a background on how you can actually get involved. So, Scott, I want to say thank you. Scott Lenham from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Thank you for joining us as part of the summit.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
You have been listening to and watching an episode from the Non-Obvious Beyond Diversity Summit, a gathering of more than 200 amazing speakers talking about diversity and inclusion on every level. And this has been part of the leading diversity and inclusion segment of our overall program. I am so excited today to welcome to our stage, our virtual stage, Mita Malik, who is a leader of diversity and inclusion. She is the head of inclusion and equity. And let me make sure I get the title right at Carta. So let's put up your title, because that's the first thing we're going to talk about. Well, first of all, welcome to the stage. I'm glad to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to have a conversation with you today.
Yeah, me too. And we were sort of talking about this before in terms of titling, because we're going to talk about leading diversity and inclusion at a company. And one of the first signals that we get about how that leadership is going to happen is through the title. And your title is an interesting and it seems intentional one. So I wonder if maybe we could just start with that. I mean, when you're fairly new in your role, you were at Unilever, I think, before.
Yes.
And now you are in a new role that is being defined by you. And so maybe let's start with that title. Like, how important is it to create a certain type of title? And what was the thinking behind your title that you use?
No, thank you. I think that's an important question. I'm really excited to be at Carta. I'm closing in on 90 days. And we are all about creating more owners in the world and all around equity ownership. So please follow us on LinkedIn to learn more. And I, as you said, Rohit, was coming from Unilever, very large multinational, and now coming to a smaller company, which is around 900 people. So I'm really excited to be building the work here. And titles are a funny thing. And you said they're also intentional. You could include many different words in a title. I think inclusion and equity was so important, especially the purpose on which Carta is founded around equity. And impact, as we'll get into, for me, is around how do people who are leading this work create impact and create an entire inclusion ecosystem that just goes beyond workforce. And so that was really important to us.
Yeah, and I love this idea of creating impact, because that's very much the intention of what we're trying to do here, which is not just have conversation. And I think what I've seen a lot of times people think about is, I mean, this big word of diversity is broadly used. I mean, it's in the title of our summit because that's the word that most people use, but it's not in your title. And what's interesting, I think, about that is a lot of people who are moving towards that impact are saying, look, just diversity in itself is not enough. So is that your point of view? Like, how do you feel about this word diversity in relation to some of the other words that are used out there?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard because I don't want to be known as a diverse candidate or a diverse talent. I want to be asked how I specifically identify, which is as a brown woman. And so I think you have to be very intentional about that. I think diversity has become a catch-all phrase because how else can you describe it? But I think why the inclusion and equity piece is so important is because you can be bringing people into your organization from different communities with different life experiences. But if you don't have a psychologically safe place in your culture, in your organization, if they are given a seat at the table and they're actually not listened to, then why bring in all the different experiences if people actually don't feel safe to speak up and drive the business? So I think the inclusion and equity piece is becoming more and more important.
Yeah, and let's hone in on the difference between inclusion and equity, because they really are two different things. So define for us, for the people who aren't working in this space, give us your definition of both of those things.
Yeah, I think fundamentally, we all want to feel included. Belonging is a new one we didn't talk about. But what does it mean? I spend so much time at work. We all do. I love my job. I love what I do. And now as we're Zooming from our homes, I'm Zooming from Jersey City, waiting for my 5 and 8-year-old to bust into our conversation. It's now more important than ever that what I'm doing, I feel valued and recognized. So I must be included. If I get a seat at the table, I need to make sure that people feel like they will listen to my ideas and I'll be respected. And even, I think more importantly, when you disagree and you offer a differing point of view. So that is really what inclusion's about, that you can have a voice, but is your voice listened to? So that's inclusion. Equity is really about fair treatment. And do we all have access to equal opportunities? And that is something that organizations, are working on through policies and programs, which we can talk about. But those are fundamentally the two differences.
Well, and you offered the perfect segue, which is to those programs. So let's talk about those. So when it comes to going into an organization, and you're in your kind of 90-day introductory phase right now, which I'm presuming is sort of the moment where you set the direction, right?
Absolutely.
Kind of make some of those policy, maybe changes, maybe introductions to policies that weren't there before. So take us inside like some of the things that you've enacted in those first 90 days. Like if you were doing a recap of your first 90 days, which people like to do, what happened in those first 90 days?
Yeah, I think that principally we think about the journey of this work, and we'll talk about the rise of the chief diversity officer and how many chief diversity officers there are now, and organizations are looking for people to be leading this work. I think principally you will see that initially CDOs were focused on workforce. How can you reflect a workforce that mirrors the communities you serve in and or the consumers who you are surprising and delighting, hopefully, with your products and services? And you're really looking at, are you, one, creating inclusive recruiting practices? How are you minimizing bias? How are you getting access to pipelines of great talent from different communities? The second is really to your point around policies and programs. What sort of policies and programs do you have in place to make sure that you are treating everyone equally and fairly? And then the last is really around how are you upskilling your leaders on their inclusive leadership journey, and how are you making them more culturally competent? So I think traditionally that was the work of what we did in this field. And what many of us are trying to do now, and what I strongly believe in, is how do you create an end-to-end inclusion ecosystem? So workforce is really important. No one will deny that you have to have a focus on. But the next pillar is really around how do your brands and services show up in the marketplace? The third is really around supplier diversity. And if you have money, who are you choosing to work with and partner with, and why? And really understanding the impact that can have. And the fourth which, as we saw on January 6th and the rioting and the violence that happened in Capitol Hill, is you can say that you stand for values, but are you ready to stand up for them when it matters? So that's principally the work that I am laying out in this world.
It strikes me that a lot of that work is not something that could happen in one little silo. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, like, how do you have to work with the different groups? I mean, previously you were at Unilever, huge company. You've got huge CSR, you've got corporate marketing, you've got product marketing, all these individual teams that often compete with one another, and then you, right? And you're trying to lead these things across the board. So how much of it can you do on your own, and how much of it do you need to rely on sort of partnership or collaboration?
I mean, I always say, if you hire me and you think, or anyone to do this work, and you think I'm going to show up with a magic wand and fix it, doesn't work that way. I am somebody who comes in as a leader to set the strategy, help with execution, and be a catalyst for change. But to your point, Rohit, there's so many stakeholders. You have to be sitting in the C-suite or have access to the C-suite. You have to have access to the CEO. You have to be working very closely with CHRO and the people team. You have to be working with legal and comms, communications, and then working with all the different business units. So, coming from a multinational, which was 150,000 people, to a much smaller company, there are differences and nuances. But, my work primarily is, I want to go in and I want to find the people at the beginning who are the most passionate about this work, the leading third, the people who I know believe in this, who I don't necessarily have to move on their journey. They're already far enough. And how can I help them? And how can they help this work and start a tipping point, right? So if I can get a few senior leaders involved in some of the initiatives, you start to see things really fly.
So how do you find those senior leaders? I mean, do you kind of look across the board and say, okay, that's a person of color, so probably they're invested in this? Or do you sort of look at what they've done? Do you check out employee blogs? I mean, what's the process to find these people who are passionate about this?
That's a great question. I follow this principle about the head and the heart. So the head, we can look at the numbers, we can see what's happening in our country, we can understand maybe academically, intellectually, the importance of this work. But I think the heart really matters. I think understanding people's connection to this work. I once had a senior leader a long time ago who wasn't that interested in getting involved in the inclusion work. And I kept meeting with them and going to him and proposing different things. And then all of a sudden came to me and said, I'm really interested in working with the work you're doing around individuals with disabilities. And I was like, wow, something must have changed in his story. And it did. His father recently had become disabled. And so our stories are constantly being rewritten, and our connection to this work is constantly being rewritten. So if you can find any entry point into why someone cares about this, that's the connection I'm looking for. So a lot of it is spending time, especially in the beginning. In my new company, I'm trying to meet as many people as I can. I want to meet every single person in that company because I want to understand their story and how I can get them to care about this work.
Some of it, I think, is really part of what you're talking about, is this idea of having empathy, right? The senior leader that you mentioned, maybe disability wasn't on his radar until his father became disabled, and now all of a sudden he had this empathy towards people with disabilities, and it becomes real. I mean, you see this with parents who have autistic children, and they become real activists or advocates for that particular cause because they have this personal experience. So obviously, when someone gets that personal experience, it changes the way they think. Not everyone has the benefit of doing that, right? So I wonder if you could talk about, as a leader, how do you get people to have that sort of empathy when they don't have a personal, like a family member who has the condition, or like someone who they know, when they don't have that personal experience?
Yeah. What I challenge leaders to do is to really think about how they're spending their time outside of work. I think the stat in 2019 was we spent $8 billion on DE&I training as a country. So let that sit in, $8 billion. Now, this is before the killing of George Floyd. I haven't seen the number for 2020. I'm guaranteeing it's likely higher. And when I have leaders come to me, let's say particularly white leaders who say, Black Lives Matters, I want to be an ally for the Black community. What can I do? The first thing I will ask them is, tell me about your personal life. Tell me how you spend your weekends. Tell me who cuts your hair when we were getting our haircuts. Tell me who your neighbors are. Tell me what restaurants you might visit. Tell me who the 5 people, let's say outside of your family, who you call for life decisions. And if they all look like you and act like you, that's where we have to start looking at ourselves and thinking about how we're self-segregating. Because I think that it is too hard to do this work. It's too hard for me to undo so much of what is actually happening at home and in our communities and expect people to behave differently when they show up at work. And so a lot of this work starts at home. And so getting people to think that way about how can you start building meaningful cross-cultural relationships. And that's the self-work that has to start, because I can take you through however many trainings or programs and try to help you at work. But all of that will be forgotten if you don't think about how you're living your life outside of work.
Yeah, it's so important. I mean, I think that one of the things that is interesting about the different sessions that we've brought together in this summit is we talk about this in many different avenues. We talk about it in terms of the books that we read to our children, or the theater that we go and see maybe virtually or maybe in person. We talk about the music and the food. I mean, all of these are aspects of us being able to appreciate people who aren't like us and to have empathy for that, which is really one of the starting points of doing this.
Absolutely, yes.
When you think about doing this you've obviously been in the biggest of companies, and now you're in a smaller company, but still by many standards, pretty big. I mean, 900 employees is not a small company.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wonder if you could translate some of what you've learned in leading DEI efforts in the large organizations to what someone might do in a smaller organization who perhaps doesn't have that many people to impact, but also doesn't have it as their day job, who doesn't have the resources, who doesn't have the ability to do this all the time.
I think if we're looking at a large organization, and what I learned is really setting up the head of diversity, the CDO, whatever the title is, for success, and making sure that they are in a prominent enough role, that they have access to stakeholders, and that they have the power and backing of the C-suite to do so. And so with that, you get to know people intimately. Like I was talking about, a lot of this work is I'm trying to assess who cares about this work, who I can enroll very quickly into this movement and get them to help. And I think you have 1 or 2 or 3 senior leaders who start to care, there's a ripple effect. And listen, people are competitive. All of a sudden, if I'm in a meeting and I see Rohit is sponsoring, as one of the executive sponsors for our Black Excellence group, I start to wonder, well, what should I be doing? I need to be involved in this. And then also talking to leaders about their legacy. At some point, you rise high enough in your career that I think people start to contemplate, what legacy do I want to leave behind? And if you're looking at your leadership team that has all men, what can we be doing to actually think about how we can get that to be gender balanced over the next 3 years? So really thinking about talking to people about that. And then you start to see the tipping point, how they start to influence others. I do think when you're working in large organizations, it can be, what's the phrase, moving a boulder up a hill. Some of these organizations have been around for decades, built in the 1900s, some of the biggest companies that are American institutions. And so some of that takes work. It's very different than being in a startup where you can actually be building things from the ground up. In some cases, you're having to dismantle and hopefully not retrofit, but dismantle policies. And particularly large companies like Unilever, one of the big pieces of work we did was around creating an inclusive culture for working mothers, working parents, and working families. It's possible. You can do it.
So talk about a little bit about your background as we close. Sometimes we start with this, but I think it's interesting actually for us to end with this, because you found your way in this space. You've had a lot of success in leading these sorts of efforts, and I wonder if you could just talk about what got you to this point, and what have you learned along that way that might help all of us, even if we're not spending all of our time or maybe working in this space, to at least be more inclined towards thinking about diversity and inclusion in those moments where we do have the opportunity to hire someone or make an impact or choose how we buy or who we buy from a little bit differently.
No, absolutely. Well, my story starts as the proud daughter of Indian immigrant parents. My younger brother and I were raised outside of Boston, and we were 3 families of color at the time growing up. And I was bullied pretty heavily, both physically and verbally growing up, by my peers. and I didn't feel like I belonged in my community. That was made very, very clear. And then also growing up in this country, I felt like I didn't belong in the country or in the world because products and services, I didn't see myself reflected at all. I loved Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. While I love Will Smith, I love Tatiana Ali even more because it was the first time I saw somebody reflected that looked like me. And so while I don't identify as Black, I do greatly identify with the Black community because growing up, I was looking for Black and brown role models. And wow, has the world changed today for all of our children. But that sense of feeling excluded, not feeling like I belonged, really drove me to have a long career in marketing as a storyteller. And I still enjoy writing to this day. But that actually is what continues to drive me to make sure that no one else ever feels that way. And whether that's thinking about the products and services that you can buy, the stories that get told and which stories don't get untold. And at the end of the day, we spend too much time at work, and I love my job and I want to be valued for it. And if I'm valued for it, I'm going to bring my best self to work. And I'm going to reach my full potential, and then the company is going to reach their full potential. And it's really as simple as that. And I think the last piece of advice is you don't have to be the head of inclusion to make change. Every single one of us can be an inclusion champion. So I ask you to really think about your journey at work. If you are hiring for a role, talk to your recruiters about how you can get access to pipelines from different communities. Get on LinkedIn, be a talent scout. There's so many fantastic people on LinkedIn you can be meeting. If you have even a few $1,000s and you're producing a video, ask the question, who am I using as a supplier and why? And why do we go to the same agencies to do the same work? And then finally, if you're sitting in a talent review and somebody says, well, I know Mita's up for this promotion, but she just had a baby. She's not going to want to travel. Well, did we ask Mita? Why are we making these assumptions about people? And would you ask that same question if I was a man? So that's my parting words of wisdom.
Really important parting words. I think that's great. Thank you so much for spending a little bit of time with us as part of this interview for the Non-Obvious Beyond Diversity Summit. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you and you taking the time to share some of your wisdom with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I can't wait to hear all the other speakers and the panels you have lined up. Thank you so much.
You have been watching a very special episode of the Non-Obvious Insights Show as part of the Beyond Diversity Summit. You can check out lots more videos at nonobviousdiversity.com, including many other leaders of diversity and inclusion efforts talking about their best tips for how to do this and how to think differently for yourself and for your organization. I'm Rohit Bhargava, host of the Non-Obvious Insights Show. Thanks for watching, and remember, always stay non-obvious.